Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about, well, three fonts. And yes, I do realise that's a decidedly arcane basis for a video. But they're not any old fonts. They're 17th century ones. And I'm willing to bet you've never seen a 17th century font. You may well have seen some splendid 15th century ones, admired various impressive 12th century ones, and there's any number carved between the 12th and the 15th century to look at. But as far as I know, there's only 8 fonts in the whole of England from the 17th century. And I'm just focusing on 3 of those. They're in the adjoining villages of Bottesford, Austin and Musson. 3 villages which actually straddle the Nottinghamshire-Leicestershire border. So at one level this is very much local history. But the reason these fonts came into existence is very much part of national history at the time. And indeed the decoration on 2 of them is part of international history. So they provide excellent examples of how local history comes about because of what's happening nationally and even internationally, while demonstrating how local knowledge provides the evidence needed to be certain that such national and international trends and fashions actually happen. Let me explain. First of all, let's get to know these 3 fonts. The oldest one is at Musson, almost certainly the next oldest is Bottesford, while the one at Austin follows probably a couple of years later. By the way, Musson is written with a T in the middle but pronounced locally without the T. At the time the name came into use, it meant the settlement or town, which was distinctive because of mice, presumably way too many mice. Now this video would never have come about had Neil Forty not emailed me in 2016 with photographs of the Musson font, with a little note to the effect that something's not quite right here. This font has always been described as 15th century, even by experts such as Nicholas Pevsner. And indeed it has the same overall shape. But looking at the faces reveals something that is most certainly not 15th century. Some of them have moustaches. And moustaches did not come into fashion until the 17th century. And when we look closer, all the faces at the bottom do not look like evangelists or any other religious symbolism that you would associate with 15th century fonts. But these ones just look like secular blokes or animals. And compared to 15th century fonts, the figural decoration isn't particularly well carved. It's not bad, but you know. Enter John Nichols. He was a very hard-working writer, printer and publisher living in London towards the end of the 18th century and, among much else, compiling a very comprehensive history of Leicestershire. And he includes a very specific mark about the Musson font. It was new in 1641. Now let's get down to specifics. The remark doesn't say that it was installed in 1641, just that it was still considered new in 1641, which means it was probably installed in the late 1630s, and there's very good reasons to think it was installed after 1633, and the most probable years are 1638, 1639, but you'll have to wait until later in this video to find out why. Let's continue with what I suspect is the next oldest of these 3 fonts, the one at Bottesford, which is a village a couple of miles northwest of Musson. Again, my thanks to Neil Forty for drawing my attention and taking these photographs. It's the most splendid of the 3 fonts, but then it would be because Tuxford Church is the burial place of the Manners family, who were created Earls of Rutland in 1525, and later the Dukes of Rutland, and the present Duke still lives down the road at Belvoir Castle. For reasons that I'll also explain later, this font cannot have been carved before 1636. Now, the 7th Earl of Rutland died in 1641 and the title passed to a distant relative in Derbyshire. So it's not really likely to be a sort of late 1630s, 1640s font. That's the fly in the ointment, so to speak. When we look at the font at Austin, which is just over a mile to the west of Bottesford, but across the county boundary, so in Nottinghamshire, not Leicestershire, we spot several similarities. And, most helpfully, an inscription dated 1662. So, I think the similarities with the Alston and the Bottisford font means that they were both created within a few years. So that's the outline of the local history. What about the bigger picture? Why do I only know of 8 fonts in total from the 17th century? For information, the other 5 are scattered about. The nearest is at Tuxford, North Nottinghamshire. This seems to be undecorated and is undated, but considered to be 17th century. The remaining 4 have been dated. Byford in Herefordshire, 1638. Great Greenford, once in Middlesex but now part of London, also 1638. East Ham, then in Essex but now in London, 1639. And Rackheath Magna in Norfolk, also 1639. So what is it about the late 1630s? Well, more specifically, who is it? This was the time when William Laud was Archbishop of Canterbury, and there was a countrywide spree of church restoration. Laud was born in 1573 and rose through the ranks of the Church of England to be a bishop, and then, in 1633, King Charles I appointed him as Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, Charles was keen to enforce uniformity of liturgical practices across the Church of England, and this process in the 1630s came to be known as Laudianism. The liturgy was often highly ritualistic and evolved into what is now usually referred to as High Church, or more flippantly as smells and bells. One way to think of Laud is the instigator of something approaching a counter-reformation, without advocating a return to the Catholic Church. Laud especially opposed Calvinism and Presbyterian approaches to running churches. Puritan clerics and laity regarded him as a formidable, indeed dangerous, opponent, because Laud was especially loathed for prosecuting opponents in the Star Chamber Court. This was regarded as less as legal prosecution and more as religious persecution. Laud's ideas and his actions increasingly aggravated the puritanical sects, and they were to become the roundheads of the imminent civil war. Laud was arrested by Parliament in 1640, just 7 years after he had been appointed Archbishop, and was executed at the start of 1645, when the First English Civil War was ending, and of course the king was executed at the same sort of time. But despite this relatively brief time in post, William Laud's influence was substantial. We have to remember that for the previous 100 years, the Reformation instigated by Henry VIII and implemented by the likes of Thomas Cromwell had been destroying religious imagery and even whole monasteries. There had been little, if any, maintenance of church buildings, and apart from replacing altars with communion tables, little replacement of liturgical furnishings, such as fonts. So by 1633 there was a lot of catching up to be done, and it was often more than patching up. Roof timbers were replaced, wooden bell frames reconstructed, elaborate font covers commissioned, and much else. Thankfully for historians, it was the fashion of the time to describe prominent timbers with a date, and typically the initials of the 2 churchwardens. Here's an example of a timber from a bell frame which itself was replaced in the 19th century. It's from the tower of St James's Parish Church in Avebury, Wiltshire. The interiors of late 16th century churches had been fairly plain. The iconoclasts had destroyed most of the decorative and devotional art. In their place, pompous memorials to Elizabethan gentry began crowding out the chancel, and Bottisford is as good an example as any. The Laudian counter-reformation steadily transformed these austere interiors with items of beauty and sanctity, and such items were most commonly associated with the 2 sacraments of the post-Reformation English Church, the Eucharist and baptism. Fonts have always had a special place within a church. They're either in front of the west door or to the west of the south door, and they also have a special place in the minds of congregations. Generation after generation had been baptised there. And while fonts were sometimes replaced, more typically 12th century and even Anglo-Saxon fonts have remained in use down the centuries. Fonts with carvings of saints would have been damaged by the mid-16th century iconoclasts. This would most likely explain why replacements were needed in the 17th century. Even when the font did not need replacing, it became the done thing to adorn the existing font with a splendid spire-like font cover. This was ostensibly to protect the holy water in the font basin from dirt or profane use. But it, of course, made a dramatic statement close to the entrance to the church. So, the font at Musson would have been very much part of this national campaign to spruce up churches. We can reasonably assume, although not prove, that Musson's previous font incorporated images of saints, so it had been damaged, perhaps badly, during an episode of iconoclasm. Note that while Musson's font has a lot of faces, none of them are religious. So even if the seesaw of religious sentiment moved away from Laudian pomp and circumstance, then this font would not be smashed by iconoclastically inclined zealots. So when John Nichols informs us that Musson's font was new in 1641, we can be sure that this was part of the Laudian revival. The same is true of Byford, Great Greenford, East Ham and Rackheath Magna, the four fonts known to have been installed in either 1638 or 1639. But what about Bottisford and Austin? We know the Austin one is dated 1662, and there are certainly stylistic similarities between them. Notably, both include tulips. Tulips, along with plants such as potatoes and peppers and tomatoes, came to Europe during the 16th century. The tulip was different from other flowers known to Europe at that time because of its intense saturated colour of the flowers. As a result, tulips became coveted luxury items, and a profusion of varieties was bred. Distribution of the bulbs was mostly via Antwerp, Amsterdam and Vienna. Some of you will know that in November of 1636 the bulb dealers developed something called Tulip Mania, and individual bulbs sold for unbelievable fortunes. This metaphorical bubble burst about 3 months later. But tulips still retained their high status, and it was only in the beginning of the 19th century when the hyacinth replaced the tulip as the most fashionable flower. Just as a little digression, the Tulip Mania generated some amusing, if perhaps unlikely, anecdotes. One was that a valuable tulip bulb was displayed on the sideboard of a merchant. A visiting sailor just assumed it was a humble onion. He picked it up and began to eat it. It was remarked that the cost of his snack might have fed a whole ship's crew for a year. Bear in mind that tulips are poisonous if incorrectly prepared. They taste bad and are considered to be only marginally edible even during famines. So I think this is a bit apocryphal rather than probable. However, the presence of tulips on one of the panels in both the Austin and Bottisford fonts would be consistent with any decade of the 17th century, and it's entirely in accord with the 1662 date on the Austin font. Quite what tulips might have symbolised to a 17th century Christian is not clear, but we can reasonably assume they were intended to be for the glory of God, analogous to, well, the ubiquitous displays of flowers in parish churches and nonconformist chapels throughout the country and indeed the world. My guess is that Musson font was broken during the Reformation and needed to be replaced. News would have quite quickly reached Bottisford, and we can imagine that the Earl of Rutland was a bit miffed that a nearby lesser church had a better font. So, very much in the manner of keeping up the Joneses, an even more elaborate one was commissioned for Bottisford. And then Austin's rector, or one of the church benefactors, commissioned the third font. The Bottisford and Austin fonts are not likely to be 1640s or even 1650s. After our Lord's demise, there was yet another frenzy of puritanical iconoclasm, and that was followed by the interregnum, or so-called Commonwealth, of 1649 to 1660. It was not a sensible time to be commissioning fonts. It implicitly expressed a sort of high church sentiment. My guess, and at this stage it can only be a guess, is that the Bottisford font was a celebration of the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, and the Austin font having pretty much the same origin. When reading up on these fonts, I discovered a remark made in 1908 by an author called Francis Bond, who wrote a whole book about fonts and font covers. He wasn't that fond of the Bottisford font. In fact, he went as far as to say hanging would not be good enough for those who wrought the fonts of Tuxford and Bottisford. There's a slight problem. The font at Tuxford is undecorated, but there is an exceptionally elaborate wooden font cover. I've not yet been able to verify the 17th century date for actual stone font at Tuxford. Sadly, the church was locked when I visited. But there was a Charles Reed, and he was born in Tuxford in 1604. He made a lot of money and became a prominent benefactor to the church. So he may have sponsored the font and its cover before his death in 1669. Now, question to anybody come across any more 17th century fonts in the vicinity of Bottisford? Or in fact, anywhere else other than the ones I've already mentioned? If so, my email address in the comments below. I'd like to thank Neil Forte for instigating this series of discoveries, and also to thank Martin Palmer for first alerting me to the implications of the Laudian revival. And special thanks to Graham Parry, who's the author of a book called Glory, Laud and Honour, for very generously sharing his views about the Mutton font back in 2016. If you want to visit these, then Bottisford Church is normally unlocked. Well worth a visit for the stupendous collection of sepulchral effigies, as well as the font. Mutton is normally locked, but the key is available, or used to be available at least, from the nearby tea room. Alston Church is normally locked, but I do understand the key is available from the pub to the east side of the churchyard. Tuxford Church is a little more difficult. At the present time, the church seems to be between vicars, and I can't find any information how to gain access. There's a banner outside saying it's open today, but that proved not to be the case.